Hey, everybody, Dr. Rob Silverman here, Proven Health Alternatives. I've got a dynamic guest today. We're going to talk about keto and something called KMT. I'm excited to have him, Dr. Dom D'Agostino, the expert in the ketogenic diet, if I'm still allowed to say that.
Yeah, well, Rob, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity. And I was kind of a late adopter to this ketogenic diet and ketogenic diet research because it started back in the 1920s. But it's been a fruitful path of basic science research and now clinical research we're doing.
Absolutely. I'm going to dig into that, but let's start off with some factoids. Let's talk about this keto craze. So let's talk about some of the highlights, some stats, if you will. 52% of Americans follow a diet or a specific eating pattern. 13 million Americans follow the ketogenic diet each year. They're adding to it. Scientific evidence suggests that the keto diet is effective for weight loss and much more. 46% of keto dieters cheat on their keto diet. The number one reason for quitting the keto diet is that's too strict. 70% of keto dieters don't track their blood ketone levels. The global effect of the diet market size is about $12 billion. And unfortunately, and I know you'll address this, keto-friendly products offering a skyrocketing retail and online. So what about this keto craze?
Yeah, there were some interesting stats. Actually, I should incorporate some of that into, my future talks. Uh, the keto craze was kicked off. I think it's multifactorial. A lot of people ask me about, the diet, obviously, and I started doing podcasts on the diet and our research in 2012. And I think between 2012 and 2013 and 14, if we use the Google search metric, there was an explosion of search engine, looking at this term. And that seemed to correlate not so much the peer-reviewed scientific research, which has also been exponentially going up, but I think people like that had podcasts, for example, just doing like, I think it was Joe Mercola, back in like 15 years ago, then Tim Ferriss, then Joe
Right.
Rogan and Rhonda Patrick and other people, not just me, many people kind of scrambled to the space, not only as a health coach, but also as basic science researchers. We have many institutions, Ivy League institutions, leading neuroscientists and metabolic physiologists transitioned some of their research to study ketogenic physiology from the context of neuroscience, metabolic disorders, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune disorders, and also now metabolic psychiatry. So this idea, believe it or not, that food affects mood. It's like, who'd have thought? So this is kind of very intuitive to us that if you change your metabolic physiology, that's going to change the underlying brain energy, but also the neuropharmacology of your brain changes significantly when you're in nutritional ketosis and neurotransmitter systems, glutamate, GABA, serotonin, dopamine, all these things change. And that's why it has an anti-seizure effect.
Amazing. Food is definitely the first step in healthcare. And you spoke about the seizure. I mean, the
Mhm.
background on the ketogenic diet, if you will, or keto
Yeah.
thought process was for epilepsy. New studies have shown on the keto diet that it boosts size and strength of aging muscles and improves brain health, to speak to what you're talking about. But you've coined a phrase, ketone metabolic therapy.
Yeah.
Why don't you go into detail on that and how do you define that?
Yeah. So the ketogenic diet or nutritional ketosis, we use the term ketogenic metabolic therapy or ketone metabolic therapy. And that sort of encompasses, it's an umbrella term for achieving, sustaining, and maintaining ketosis, like therapeutic ketosis. So that could be with time restricted eating, intermittent fasting. That can be with a ketogenic diet. And there are many versions of the ketogenic diet. And another topic that we study is exogenous ketone supplementation. And it could even be like medium chain triglyceride oil, esters, ketone salts, and a variety of different compounds.
So,
So the ketogenic diet is unique from a dietary therapy perspective. KMT is unique because it is defined by an objective biomarker. So that
mhm.
is blood ketones urine ketones, sort of the old method, and also breath ketones, breath acetone. So if we measure blood, we're measuring beta-hydroxybutyrate. In the urine, it's typically acetoacetate. That spontaneously decarboxylates to acetone, which is a volatile organic compound that we can measure. We measure it in blood, but you can measure it in breath. There's a couple breath devices that I have around my office here that I use. Uh, KMT is a defined by objective biomarkers. And when you elevate and sustain ketosis, you are in that therapeutic state. And that has proven applications and it has unproven emerging applications. And we study both.
Fascinating stuff. Those are the three ketone bodies. So would it
Yep.
be fair to say that ketone metabolic therapy is allowing the patient to become keto adapted?
Yeah, keto adaptation is a process that when you transition your metabolic physiology to burn fat and create ketones in the liver, that changes fatty acid oxidation enzymes in not only in the muscle, but also in the liver. And accelerated beta oxidation of fatty acids in the liver will contribute to an abundance of acetyl-CoA, and then that condenses to a form acetoacetate and then beta-hydroxybutyrate. The liver is interesting because it cannot use ketones as an energy source. So those
Mm.
ketones produced in the liver spill into circulation, and the ketones then become very powerful energetic molecules for the brain, probably most importantly, and the heart. The heart uses a lot of fat, but it can use ketones too. Surprisingly, it doesn't use like a high percentage of glucose. The heart does. The brain does, but in conditions of fasting, starvation, or ketogenic diet, you can shift your brain energy metabolism to 50% or more energy production just from ketone bodies. And that was not known or understood until 1967. Dr. George Cahill and Oliver Owen at Harvard Medical School fasted subjects for 40 days, and then they looked at the AV difference in brain energy and the fuel supply to the brain. And they determined that the brain was surprisingly not a slave to glucose, that it could had the metabolic flexibility to adapt from using glucose to using ketones. And when you are in a state of ketosis over time, you upregulate ketogenic enzymes, but also you upregulate ketolytic enzymes, which are the enzymes in the tissues that allow your tissues to use ketones as an energy source. And you also upregulate the transporter called the monocarboxylic acid transporter, the MCT transporter. So you can increase it in 2 weeks. You could have a 50% increase in, like, if you look at, the protein for MCT. So, and some people adapt fast and some people adapt slow. If you're an athlete or you practice carb restriction, you're probably already semi-adapted. But some people, it could take months to really feel normal and adapt because, there are some side effects to the ketogenic diet we could talk about, the keto flu.
Oh, yeah. When we get to keto flu, oh, I got a
Mhm.
story for you on that. So, to recap what you said, being keto adapted is the ability now to produce ketone bodies and use fat as fuel versus carbohydrates. Fat
Yep.
is a much better source of fuel for brain than carbs. So, carbs are kind of like dirty fuel, and fat is sort of like clean fuel. You
Yeah.
mentioned
Well,
change.
I'd
Right?
like to quickly mention that when we're fasting on a ketogenic diet, the fats typically do not cross the blood-brain barrier unless they're MCT oil, medium chain triglycerides, and also short chain fatty acids like butyrate, for example, which is an interesting postbiotic. That can cross the blood-brain barrier, but like the long chain fatty acids don't. So the liver chops them up into water soluble fat molecules. That's how I think about it. And then they can easily cross. Actually, you have the same concentration in blood as you do in cerebrospinal fluid. So they easily cross the blood-brain barrier, and they're used as a source of energy and provide more ATP. We say the delta G of ATP hydrolysis is actually quite higher when you metabolize ketones as an energy source, and you create less reactive oxygen species. And then we study ketones as signaling molecules, energy molecules and signaling molecules. There's a ketone receptor. There's epigenetic effects. It suppresses the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is important for autoimmune disorders. And I created a diet that was used in a study published in Nature Medicine in 2015, showing that beta-hydroxybutyrate is the metabolite that directly prevents the assembly and the activation of the NLRP3 inflammasome.
Right. I think you did a study with that, and I think also it blocks the unveiling of gout, as I recall.
Yeah, yeah, it's involved in that too. Yeah, suppressing the inflammation
So,
associated with that. And that's interesting because uric acid can increase with certain types of ketogenic diets. And it also uses the same MCT transporter. So there's some competition at the level of the kidney. So you could have a spike up in uric acid when you start, but with keto adaptation, that usually comes down in about, 6 to 10 weeks, typically, the
wow.
uric acid. So just important to know, like a little tidbit of information that if you're getting blood work and you get a red flag for that, that usually mine has come down. It's really low now. My uric acid's like, 2, 3, after a big meal, it might shoot up to like 5 or something, but generally
Interesting.
low.
So MCT oil, medium chain triglycerides. So you're specifically saying C8 and C10 pass the
Mhm.
blood-brain barrier, not to get too
Does.
technical, but in coconut oil, lauric acid, C12 doesn't.
Well, that's a good question, actually. There's some evidence that it may. Probably not as easy. The longer the carbon chain, the more unlikely it is to pass through. I didn't even know that MCT has crossed the blood-brain barrier. We were administering MCT oil combined with an exogenous ketone salt and in rats and like tube feeding them, and then we took out the hippocampus, and it's like, whoa, the MCT oil. And then I looked it up. This is many years ago, and then come to find out it really was not. I mean, maybe I found one publication, but it was very conclusive to me that when you orally administer the MCT, that it can, and now I guess it's well known, but at the time it was new information to me when we were looking at our metabolomics data. So that's really interesting because, you can take, it's an oil that has tremendous, like, metabolic effects. It's an awesome source of fuel, and then it crosses the blood-brain barrier too. And there's good research showing that it can help people with mild cognitive impairment. It can improve the, brain function.
It's funny you mentioned that. I have patients that come in with a mild concussion, and I'll give them some MCT oil and ketone salts,
Mm-hmm.
and bang, you turn the brain on right away. Great
Yep.
takeaway. You talked about beta hydroxybutyrate. You said it's more than just an energy source, it's also a cell signaling source. So would it be
Yeah.
fair to say that beta hydroxybutyrate out of the ketone bodies is without question the gold medal winner because of its dual purpose, its pleiotropic effects?
Well, beta hydroxybutyrate is the most stable ketone that you can deliver. So we have an ester that is probably the most effective, although it tastes very bad, that when you consume it, it elevates acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate in a 1-to-1 ratio. And then that particular molecule has the strongest neuroprotective anti-seizure effects. And we've moved some of the rodent model animal studies to studies we're doing at Duke University now, mostly for tonic-clonic seizures associated with oxygen toxicity, which is more of a military limitation for Navy SEAL divers. So, but it has in, I think we studied maybe 5 or 6 different animal models, 6 in animal models of seizures, and it's ubiquitously most effective in that. However, the combination you just mentioned, MCT oil
Mhm.
combined with exogenous ketone salts, are what I actually prefer, even though I've done a lot of research with the esters and they may be more potent, but I think there's limitations because the ketone esters need to be broken down by the liver. And one of the molecules that you make a ketone ester with is 1,3-butanediol. And that is technically a dialcohol. It's an alcohol that needs to be broken down through the alcohol dehydrogenase pathway, and it makes a beta hydroxybutyrate aldehyde molecule. So the take home message is that the esters may be great for acute applications related to military or maybe some clinical scenarios too. However, if someone's going to take an exogenous ketone day in and day out, and use it as a supplement. A ketone electrolyte that we call ketone salt with MCT is, the ideal choice. And that's what I use personally.
So the reason for the salt, as my understanding, it's NaCl, but it comes with ketone bodies, is because when you switch from a carbohydrate-laden diet to a fat-laden diet, carbs also allow you to hold water. So you swish the water out, you lose your electrolytes. And doesn't that lead you down the path of a ketone flu?
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of people don't know that. Yeah, but when you get into nutritional ketosis, that typically involves suppression of the hormone insulin. And
Mm.
then insulin's involved in sodium reabsorption. So if you don't get a minimum of 2000 milligrams extra sodium per day, it can cause, symptoms of fatigue, orthostatic hypotension, headache. You get a significant, in some people, contraction of plasma volume because of the sodium. Yeah, you dump the sodium, and also with that, you can dump potassium, you can dump magnesium, and even calcium. So a balanced beta-hydroxybutyrate electrolyte that has, sodium, probably most importantly, although some people still demonize sodium, magnesium, calcium, potassium, and that has all that would be ideal. And then the mineral load, so it's actually the molecule is sodium ionically bound to beta-hydroxybutyrate. So it's not sodium chloride, it's sodium beta-hydroxybutyrate, and then calcium beta-hydroxybutyrate, for example. And that helps to restore, replenish electrolytes as navigate the metabolic transition to ketosis. And the beta hydroxybutyrate, then when you consume it, surprisingly, it interconverts to acetoacetate too. So if you're to measure urine acetoacetate, you can actually measure breath acetone and it'll go up. So the beta hydroxybutyrate gets into circulation, and then you have enzymatic conversions and sort of a redox balance of the ketones that you can measure. And there's quite significant differences between the ratios of the ketones in different people. And I'm still trying to unpack what that means, metabolically, physiologically, and the unique. Everybody's a unique metabolic entity, and it's interesting that when you consume even exogenous ketones or get into dietary ketosis, the ratios of the ketones tend to be quite different in different people.
Interesting stuff. I mean, those are great conversation pieces, but I want
Mhm.
to reel it back in. I want to ask you, what are the proven applications of KMT? And then for those who don't know, what is, that ketogenic, where do you hit ketosis? What's the definition of it?
Mhm.
Is it 60% fat? Is it 75% fat? How many carbs can I have? Protein, that kind of ratio, if you will.
Yeah, great questions. Well, epilepsy would probably be, top of the chain, and a lot of people don't even know the history of the with the Mayo Clinic, developing it in 1921. So that we had the 100-year anniversary like 3 years ago of the ketogenic diet. So epilepsy and pretty much all seizure disorders. It's very interesting that the ketogenic diet works for seizure disorders independent of the etiology, meaning that if you have temporal lobe epilepsy, absence epilepsy, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Deuce syndrome, or if you have seizures related to an inborn error of metabolism, for example, glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome, where you basically have low glucose to the brain, or even genetic disorders that cause seizures. Angelman syndrome, as an example, something that we studied in the lab. So even in the presence of a persistent molecular pathology, you could follow a ketogenic diet. You're not acutely changing gene transcription, although now we are looking at epigenetic regulation with ketones. You can symptomatically manage a genetic disorder with a metabolic therapy. So seizure disorders, that's well accepted. Inborn errors of metabolism, pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency, for example, there's many ones that, we study different ones. And then like type 2 diabetes, I would say it's now accepted that if you have, you know, that type 2 diabetes can be described as carbohydrate intolerance. So simply lowering your carbohydrates and managing that. Weight loss, I think now we can, accept that low carb diets included in that is ketogenic diets. And then you have the autoimmune disorders too, which I know you're like an expert on that. I have a good friend of mine, Dr. Nick Norwitz, PhD from Oxford, medical student finishing up at Harvard. He
Mhm.
had irritable bowel disorder, ulcerative colitis, and he just, published a paper, a case series showing that a number of people, and the ketogenic diet is an elimination diet and it has remarkable effects on autoimmunity. And that's an interesting conversation. But I also think like one of maybe the most important is managing infections. So I've had people that have Lyme's disease, Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, herpes simplex virus, even. And they adopt these strict ketogenic diets. Maybe they do intermittent fasting, and it's the only thing that works for them in some cases. And I do think that the root cause of many neurological diseases, perhaps even cancer, could be an infection. And this is something that I've recently been paying more attention to. And I think it merits consideration, and people need to look into, for example, Alzheimer's disease patients, almost all of them looked at have Borrelia,
Mm.
a spirochete in the brain, also cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr virus can contribute to different cancers. So I think dietary, improving immune system function, improving the gut, enhancing immune surveillance. The gut is the major, I teach GI physiology
Mhm.
to the medical students. And my main thing that I want to get to them is that gut health, your gut is the barrier.
Mhm.
It serves such an important barrier function. And when that's compromised, when you have leaky gut or intestinal permeability, and that's compromised, it sets off a firestorm of, autoimmunity and inflammation. You can measure this, if you get a little gut bug, just measure HSCRP. It goes off the charts. Mine is usually almost non-detectable, but a very few occasions I'll get like a gut bug if I travel internationally. And I get excited because I do my blood work to see what's going on with my immune system, and my, HSCRP is like off the charts. And it just shows that your gut is really the most important aspect of your immune system. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for ketogenic metabolic therapies in some of these autoimmune disorders.
Oh, here, here, indeed. Forsooth, as my friend from Oxford
Mhm.
would say. I agree
Yeah.
with you. The gut is the epicenter of your health. 80% of your immune cells are in your gut. It's where macro
Yeah.
and micronutrients are absorbed, which will lead
Yep.
me to a following question in a moment. But to reiterate, the ketogenic diet is shown to be good for metabolic syndrome, diabetes, obesity. But interesting in
Mhm.
obesity, it's not just a reduction in fat mass, visceral fat mass,
Yeah. Good point. Yep. Yeah.
decrease.
Visceral fat mass. Yeah. It's typically associated with insulin resistance. And if you're making ketones, you have significantly pushed your insulin through the floor. You've dropped your insulin because ketone production is inversely linked to your insulin. So you basically have to lower insulin down to a certain threshold to actually for your liver to even make ketones. So it's a very, the elevation and sustainment of ketosis is a really good indication that you're improving, reversing insulin resistance, which plays a role with intra-omental fat. Yeah, that visceral fat.
Outstanding. It
Mhm.
increases physical activities, which we're going to get to also. I want to make
Yep.
sure we cover that. As you talked about neurodegenerative disease, because of the gut to brain axis, autoimmune really stokes the immune system. So it begs the question, man, I want to do this diet. How do I get into it? Is it 60% fat? Is it 70% fat? Is it 80% fat? What do I have to do?
Yeah, so clinically, the ketogenic diet is defined by a macronutrient ratio, right? The original diet for pediatric epilepsy, we say that's a 4-to-1 classical ketogenic diet. 4 parts fat to 1 part essentially protein and some fiber, a little bit of carbs. And that's in grams, not in percentages. So it's even more the clinical prescription is even very, very confusing for many people because it's in grams and not percentages. And fat, of course, is 9 calories per gram. So what that works out on paper is like almost 88 to 90% fat, the clinical ketogenic diet. But now we know for adult epilepsy that you could use a modified ketogenic diet, also called the modified Atkins diet. And that's more like a 2-to-1 ketogenic diet, which is more liberal in protein. And it allows the introduction of like fibrous vegetables. So you get some prebiotic fiber and stuff in there. And I think that's beneficial too. So on paper, essentially what that could mean is like, for clinically 25 grams or less of carbohydrates, typically, for most people. And then the protein level is about 1 to maybe upwards of, if you're very athletic and you have a lot of muscle mass, like 1.5 grams per kilogram, of protein. So for someone, 200 pounds would be like upwards of 150, like capped out of protein, or 1.6. Dr. Stu Phillips may argue that. And if you're like an extreme athlete, it could be as high as like 1.8 grams per kilogram, or even 1 gram, if we do it by pounds, 1 gram per pound, which I tend to do because I kind of favor a higher protein ketogenic diet.
Right.
On some days, if I'm real active. If I'm not active, I don't get as much protein. And then the fat sources too is a topic of great debate, especially with the seed oils. And I do think they are problematic. But if you're eating seed oils, you're kind of eating processed food. But I do not demonize saturated fat. I think it's fine. Coconut oil, MCT oil is of course saturated fat. But monounsaturated fats are great. And that could be olive oil. I use copious amounts of olive oil. I do use MCT oil, macadamia nut oil, avocado oil. Like these are great oils if you do use oils. And butter. Butter, of course, is fine, which has butyrate in it, which has also some beneficial effects for the gut.
Yes. Great stuff. So let me break this down a little bit.
Mhm.
From calories, I should be consuming to get into ketosis. About 75% of my calories should be fat.
That's a good place to start for sure.
About 20% of my calories should be protein.
Yep. That's essentially
And
what I do. Yep.
5% of calories should come from carbohydrates.
Yeah, fibrous carbs, which could do green veggies. I get wild blueberries every day, maybe like an apple here and there. And that's a good place to start with the ketogenic diet. We'll get most people into a state of mild ketosis. And I do think as a lifestyle approach, if you're not metabolically managing a severe disorder, like I would gravitate away from that, 4-to-1 ketogenic diet and just do more of a modified ketogenic approach just to stay in a mild state of ketosis.
Now, there's some people they're going to ask you about grams and carbs.
Mhm.
I've read, correct me if there's an update, 50 grams of carbs or less will probably get you into ketosis. 25%, you'll really hit the secret spot.
Yeah. So if those carbohydrates are like more than 1/3 fiber, for example, if we look at the carbohydrate of broccoli, right? More than 1/3 of that is fiber. And that fiber, it actually can break down to short chain fatty acids, which are kind of like ketones, right? So it will depend on the sugar content, the starch content. So basically, no sugar, no starch. Although, I get, probably almost a full cup, half a cup to a full cup of wild blueberries every day, and I can stay in ketosis. I usually get that later in the evening. Try not to eat too close to bed, but
Mm.
that is typically okay if you are active, if you have like a high metabolism. But for some people, you really need to, especially with the initiation, the lower carb you do in the beginning and the faster you adapt, then you can titrate the carbs back in, maybe some fruit and more veggies. And I do, some people that follow carnivore are completely anti-fiber, but
Yeah.
for me, and I can do that, but I don't do it like every day. But occasionally, if I'm traveling or busy, I'll just eat fish or steak or something, or eggs, and just do kind of light on the fiber. But I generally feel better, and I feel my gut health is better if I incorporate 20 to 30 grams of fiber per day. 30 is kind of pushing it, but a good, yeah, 20 grams of fiber per day. And that sounds a lot, especially to someone who's like follows a carnivore approach. But for me, that works best.
Yeah, you brought it up. Let's do rapid fire. Let's have some
Yeah,
fun. Let's do it New
sure.
York style. Here we go.
Yep.
Keto diet, carnivore diet. Tell me
Yeah.
what.
Yeah, I think they are great elimination diets that are highly therapeutic for a wide range of disorders. The science is very heavy, supporting the ketogenic diet as a metabolic therapy, and the science is emerging, most of it anecdotal, for a carnivore diet. And you can do a keto carnivore diet, of course, too. You could do a hybrid or amalgamation of the two. So I'm in favor of both, and I do occasionally follow a carnivore diet, and I follow a modified ketogenic diet.
Keto versus paleo diet.
Paleo is a great place for people to start if they're on a standard American diet, and it will help them get fat adapted and is therapeutic in many ways. If they are metabolically managing a medical disorder, a ketogenic diet will be far more therapeutic.
Keto versus vegan diet.
Vegan diets have some applications for, I think they are a step above the standard American diet for most people in improving cardiometabolic health biomarkers. So that's, clear, very clear, especially due to high fiber content, low sugar content, etc. A vegan diet can enhance your innate immune system, and a ketogenic diet, a recent study came out, even 2 weeks of it can robustly impact your adaptive immunity. And this is of high interest to me because it can further augment certain cancer therapies that we're interested in, like checkpoint inhibitors, PD-1 inhibitors specifically. So yeah, a vegan diet you can do a vegan ketogenic diet, actually. The very first blog article I ever did for ketonutrition.org, which is my website, is a plant-based ketogenic diet because I get a lot of requests for that, especially in the Indian populations and some of the Asian populations.
So some of the side effects to a ketogenic diet.
Yeah, well, the keto flu gets a lot of attention, and I do think I never experienced that, but that is a very real thing. Fatigue and headache, which I think could be lumped in with a keto flu, and that could be just the metabolic transition of converting your brain from using glucose to using ketones. It's almost like glucose withdrawal in the brain. And I also believe people have thrown the theory out that there's like a die off. So if you have an infection, if you have toxins in the body, and you transition to ketosis, and I've seen this in some blood work that your body's like dumping heavy metals, dumping toxins and things like that, that potentially is something to look at. I think the science, anecdotally, I'm convinced something's going on there, but it needs to be studied. But I think that the electrolyte imbalance that can happen in the first 2 weeks to 4 weeks to 6 weeks, and then the metabolic transition from lowering your blood glucose. And then the liver is a little bit sluggish in some people to producing ketones, but you can mitigate a lot of that with ketone salts and MCT. So, and maybe, I've communicated with people that are completely naive to ketogenic diets, set them up on the right diet with supplementation, and they rarely get a keto flu or side effects. In the literature, you'll find kidney stones are higher in people who follow ketogenic diets, and that may be due to just not drinking enough and also not getting enough potassium and electrolytes like magnesium. This can prevent kidney stones from happening. So they're the two sort of things that I think are most important. And then some people just have fatty acid or fat intolerance. And I think there's various SNPs that people will have that they basically do not have robust activity of certain fatty acid oxidation enzymes. And when I look at blood work, a red flag would be a persistent elevation of triglycerides, even under a caloric deficit. I've seen this, and I think these are people that may have they need to do a genetic test, and what sometimes you'll find is that they just have impaired certain enzyme systems, fatty acid oxidation enzymes, and there are many of them. So these are things that you kind of have to be aware of in looking at blood work.
I'm not going to ask a biomarker because I'm going to save that.
Yeah.
But a genetic marker. So you're saying they're genetic markers. So your genetics may be such that the keto will work better for you than for me because we have different backgrounds.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's an emerging area of science. Like, looking at our genetic data, I use like GB Health Watch and some other things for me personally, my body is really great at metabolizing fat. You know, my ketones can get out, I transition easily. However, I do have a mutation for the MPC1L1 receptor, which is the Niemann-Pick like C1 like receptor. So that transporter is in the gut, and it facilitates cholesterol and other lipid absorption. So when I take a low dose of ezetimibe, I did an ezetimibe experiment because I had a hunch, or a functional medicine doctor looked at my blood work and said, "Hey, go do a genetic test." And bingo, I had this rare disorder, and I'm a hyper absorber, but
Mhm.
it also makes me a hyper responder to a
Right.
low dose of. I do not like the idea of taking a statin drug, but a very low dose of ezetimibe has little or no side effects and can cut my ApoB in half. And it comes with also a reduction in triglycerides, which I've seen, and that's not changing anything in my diet. So I'm all about, you know, nutrition above and beyond drugs, but I think in some cases, which could be dictated by your genetics, pharmacotherapy can be helpful for some people.
So let me tell you a little story. I am in a podcast room with two medical doctor females on my left, two female doctors on my right. And here I am going, I love the ketogenic diet. It's about 5 years ago.
Mhm.
And the ladies looked at me and they turned around and they started to hack into me. They're like, it doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for us being females. And
Mhm.
it was an interesting moment because I was about ready to respond. And I probably would have regretted that I responded. And my wife gave me a head shake, don't do it. So I went back to the data,
Yep.
found out that women do, at least at that time, respond differently than men because of estrogen. And the
Yep.
data indicated that women need to detox their estrogen at the beginning and during the ketogenic diet. So for the update, Dr. D'Agostino,
Mhm.
are there sex-based differences in a ketogenic approach?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because for years, you know, scientists just studied males, right? Because there's less variability, you know, because you don't have the estrous cycle to deal with, which does significantly impact metabolic parameters and metabolic physiology. I will say this is an area of ongoing investigation, and I'm glad some people are studying it. We're studying it in the lab, you know, in lab animals. We're also looking at differences in our clinical trial now. What I can say with confidence is that female physiology has more of a reactionary response to hypoglycemia, which is sort of a consequence of carbohydrate restriction. And this can do a number of different things, including reduce the conversion of T4 to T3, the active form. So we've seen that. And then there's publications on that. And it can also, surprisingly, in the group of women that had the low T3, they had remarkable body composition. They're exceptionally lean. So this is a little bit confusing because the women that were most lean and athletic on a ketogenic therapy also had the you know the best body composition, like the lower fat. So I think maybe what also happens is that your body becomes more sensitive to the thyroid hormones. So I think thyroid hormone sensitivity is enhanced. I would also argue, because I've seen a lot of male blood work too, and some of it looks hypogonadal. However, these are males that have no sign, libido or muscle wise, that they're hypogonadal. So I think it's also being in a state of ketosis and having very, very good metabolic health can enhance hormone receptor sensitivity in a way that would, on paper, it looks like, you know, low hormones, but it's enhancing that. And what are some other thoughts? Yeah, and I guess cortisol too is something that I get questioned a lot about with females. And I have seen blood work to indicate like a doubling or tripling of cortisol when females do. But the blood, I would say more than half of the blood work that I've saw are females that start ketogenic diets and they're over exercising. They're like type A personalities and they're under caloric restriction because they're using the diet to like lose weight or they're prepare for a contest or something like that. So I think there's some evidence for lower levels of T3 and when your hormone levels, your insulin levels get very low, and for example, you're breastfeeding, that could make it hard for women to like make milk. So, I've have a colleague that had that problem that even with mild carbohydrate restriction, that altered her hormones and physiology in a way that impacted, I guess, prolactin and lactation. But I also think that if women get sufficient amount of protein with a ketogenic diet, that could mitigate some of the problems associated with ketogenic diets.
So there's a difference. Boys and girls are different. We need to address them differently.
It
And
is.
as you
Yep.
said, you made a good point. Hormones are the basis for some of the differences. So here's the big
Hmm.
question.
Yep.
And I'm sure you probably heard this one before. Dom, I got a problem. All my practitioner friends were putting people on a ketogenic diet. They're going to their primary care physician. 6 weeks into the ketogenic diet, boom, LDL's up. HDL is kind of confused. Total cholesterol's off the mark. They pull them off immediately. They want to put them on a statin drug. They say the diet is not effective. Help me.
Yeah, this is a question that comes out a lot. And I think Dave Feldman is spearheading the Citizen Science Foundation investigating this question because it seems like there's not enough cardiovascular researchers that are investigating this. What I would say, just, peripherally, is that if your LDL skyrockets or goes up in the context of improved biomarkers across the board. So, blood pressure, we forget about that. But typically, when you go on a ketogenic diet, blood pressure improves. You can get off medication, triglycerides go down, HDL goes up, um, uh, glycemic control is improved. So, hemoglobin A1C goes down. And HSCRP typically might elevate a little bit in the beginning, but typically goes down. So and I've gotten quite a few emails where all those things I just mentioned are significantly improved in the context of an elevated LDL and an elevated, correlating to that would be apolipoprotein B, ApoB. In that context, I would say that you could determine to see if maybe you are a hyper responder. And if you're going to explore pharmacotherapy, which I think, like as I did, could be an option for some people to take the minimal effective dose to bring that down within normal range. And for me, it also lowered my triglycerides a bit. But if you have a history of cardiovascular disease, if you've had previous, like a heart attack or a stroke, I think it's important to be at this point in time. I think it's important to get that number within a normal range. And I'm just going to say that just to cover my ass, kind
Yeah,
of,
gotcha.
until the research conclusively, with more than a decade of research, because it takes a long time for elevated ApoB, it takes a protracted period of time to get, cardiovascular effects from the elevation of that biomarker. So,
Great answer, because that's one of the things I hear. That is the proverbial knock, if you will, because it's a snapshot in time early. So the
yeah,
theory is I switch to fat till I become a ketogenic or a keto adapted process. It seems to
yep,
cause an elevation in cholesterol markers or the traditional lipid panel, which you and I really don't look at
yep,
anymore. We look at the depth, the particle size. Like you mentioned, the
yeah,
ApoB, HSC reactive protein, HOMA IR, et cetera, et cetera. Not trying to woo everybody with
yeah.
terms, but how can someone optimize KMT?
Yeah, well, I think there's a wide variety of ways to do that. There are supplements that I mentioned that can be important. If you're initiating carbohydrate restriction or ketone metabolic therapy, time restricted feeding is a way to do that if that is something that is good for you. But if you do like eating breakfast and you do like eating dinner, you don't have to do that. You can incorporate medium chain triglycerides, and in addition to that, exogenous ketone salts. Keto Start is what I use, and I think that's, beta-hydroxybutyrate, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium. You get all your electrolytes. You're delivering your electrolytes, and at the same time, you're delivering beta-hydroxybutyrate, and it's like 10 grams per packet. So I like that supplement. Berberine is great too. Sometimes people like trend to higher blood glucose, so they have higher gluconeogenesis, or maybe their insulin sensitivity needs to be improved. I think berberine is a great supplement. I've experimented with it. I don't use it because it can give me a mild headache, and I think it seems to sensitize me more to caffeine. But I've followed blood work of other people using it, and I think it's something that can increase ketones and lower blood glucose. Allulose, which is an epimer of fructose. I use the RX sugar version of allulose, is D-allulose. When you consume allulose, surprisingly, it lowers blood glucose, and it also has a GLP secretagogue effect, which means it helps your body release a little bit, more GLP. And I think that's an interesting. And then you have exercise, you have sun, carnitine, magnesium might be important for some people, but you need to measure that in the blood, and prebiotic fiber and postbiotics too might be helpful. These are all things. I can't really think of anything else, but the diet usually sort of does its thing if you nail down the macros, get the fatty acid composition right, and get your protein, adjust your protein to whatever your more or less your protein needs are in your body composition. So if you're trying to put on muscle, you do need to do a higher protein ketogenic diet.
I'm going to piggyback on the allulose. I've been using it in the office. My wife has used it to cook with. I've used it to sweeten my Java, because I'm an organic Java guy, as you can plainly see.
Yep.
Drinking through everything, it keeps me nice and calm. I agree with you on the allulose. A couple other things I would add to that I found to be helpful is turmeric results in blood glucose stabilization and lower triglyceride levels. Chromium, talking about your GLUT4 enzymes in the liver and muscle.
Yep.
You talked about acetyl-L-carnitine, alpha-lipoic acid. I mean, you mix alpha-lipoic acid with berberine. That's a great one.
Love that. Yep.
Yeah. Omega-3 fatty acids, another great choice. And if you want to decrease inflammation, proresolving mediators and PEA. So we just gave them a plethora of options to supplement with a diet. And that's what it is, supplements to a diet. So let's move it along. Let's go for it. We talked about before, what are the biomarkers that are most important for tracking metabolic health?
Yeah, maybe about 5 years ago, I got turned on to continuous glucose monitoring.
Love it.
So I will, disclose that I am an advisor, a research health advisor for Levels Health, which creates an app that syncs with the hardware being a Dexcom device or an Abbott device. And this is used to monitor your glycemic variability in response to different foods. And I think that's one of the most important biomarkers: continuous glucose monitoring, blood pressure, insulin, triglycerides, HDL, ApoB, we talked about, vitamin D, and of course, doing just a comprehensive metabolic panel and CBC.
All works great. You did hemoglobin A1C, outstanding. What about some particle size cholesterol markers? You're not even concerned about that with the keto. It's a myth.
I don't delve too into that because I just kind of look at it high level. I do it myself, but the interpretation of that is I don't think it's super actionable at this point in time.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think just ApoB, I do look at LP(a).
Genetic marker for heart attack.
Yep.
Yes. 25% of Americans have it, means 40% of your family members have it. Critical marker. Everybody mark that down. That's a key takeaway in the podcast. One of the key takeaways. If your doctor's not testing for it, you need to ask them why. Unfortunately, statins have a tendency to raise LP(a). So it's a conversation, but empirically, we've seen a decrease in LP(a) with lifestyle, ketogenic diet, or keto type diets, if you will. Talked about time restrictive eating or intermittent fasting. We know they're both different. Do you feel that ketogenic diet is extremely synergistic to have possible good outcomes with intermittent fasting / time restrictive eating?
Yes, I do. So if it's synergistic, maybe define what you mean by that.
So everybody wants to do, we'll call it intermittent fasting for lack of a better term, even though it is time restrictive eating. So they want to know what diet is going to be most effective. So we have Gundry out there, who I think is wonderful, and he talks about intermittent fasting, creating ketone bodies. So you could start with that and dig into Do you need to do a ketogenic diet to produce ketone bodies and get all the benefits from them?
I get this question a lot. I think simply doing a mild carbohydrate restriction and within your eating window, if you just simply eliminate, added sugar, starches, and carbohydrates, you can enter a nice state of mild ketosis through that intermittent fasting period, during your work hours, for example. And that often gives people greater cognitive function. They feel more alert. They feel, less inflammation, and they feel better overall. A lot of people tell me that, just they feel better not eating. And when they eat, they just feel sluggish. They might get a headache. This could be a histamine response. I think there's many different reasons that, people need to identify what food allergies they have. And I think that's super important. But and I have a few myself, and I generally feel more robust, energetic, and alert if I'm either under eating or in a sort of a semi-fasted state.
So not everybody produces the same amount of ketones on a
Yep.
long-term fast. We would agree with that.
Yeah,
So
for
there was a
sure.
study that came out in Nutrients in 2024, and I know you're familiar with it. It showed that low levels of ketones during fasting did in fact decrease body weight, waist circumference, glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and also had a positive effect on uric acid. However, high levels of ketones during fasting basically had 3 times the effect. So
Mhm.
are some people better ketone producers? Is it that they're on a longer term of fast? I mean, basically, how does that go?
Yeah, I think ketones are kind of like a surrogate marker for just you know, uh, improved glycemic control, lower insulin, and better insulin sensitivity. And also, the ketones are directly correlated with fat oxidation in the liver. So, an accelerated fat oxidation. So, if your ketones are elevated, you're generally mobilizing more fat. That fat's getting to the liver. You're converting it to ketones in the context of low insulin and enhanced insulin sensitivity. And also, I think it's also indicative of like a healthy central nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system is really important for ketosis, as is even like a healthy cortisol levels. Like sometimes I've seen blood work with people who have, you know, it's good to have a cortisol spike in the morning, and if you don't get that, that's actually can be detrimental. That can be a sign of like adrenal burnout. So you want to, look at your cortisol levels, see a nice elevation in the morning, and that should definitely be tapering off later in the day in blood work, and just kind of looking at sort of the various people who've messaged me. Sometimes I see low cortisol, low body temperature, and things associated with low ketones, and I think that could just be a consequence of, metabolic damage, or just the metabolism is not as robust as it should be. And I see a lot of variability. And I do think it's important for people to measure their hormones. Obviously, thyroid, testosterone, DHEA, health, good levels of these hormones within normal range will correlate to a normal ketogenic metabolism. And then if you have, altered hormones in different ways, that can disrupt the ketogenic process.
Big question. What are you working on as far as a project in the lab?
Yeah, thanks for asking. We're working on a dozen or more different projects, I think. We're finishing up a study now where we use lipopolysaccharide, LPS, and we look at the effects of LPS on like neuroinflammation and learning and memory. So that, creating systemic inflammation creates neuroinflammation, and that can significantly impact our mood, learning and memory, and things like that. So we're doing a study in that now. We're looking at allulose, and we're putting allulose on different types of cancer cells, and we're comparing that to fructose and different levels of glucose. And allulose seems to have a really nice suppression effect on, cancer cell proliferation. And we're looking at different cancer lines. So that's something in progress now. We're working on a proposal for glioblastoma that would involve KMT, but also oxidative stress therapy in the form of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. and also some off-label drugs that can further augment the ketosis and also further dramatically enhance the oxidative stress in the cancer cells. So I'm excited about that. Oxygen toxicity study, seizures. We do that in the lab, but we also have human studies at Duke. And we're looking at an inborn error metabolism called POMP disease.
Mm.
It's also called glycogen storage disease type 2. And we have POMP mice and we're giving them different ketogenic therapies. And we're looking at the therapeutic effects of that. And then with the medical students, we're targeting ultra processed food and trying to
Mm.
understand the dangers of that and then create sort of like a student advocacy group against ultra processed food.
63% of the calories we consume are from ultra
Yeah,
processed food.
for sure.
LPS, that's
Yep.
exciting for me. Lipopolysaccharide, it's an
Hmm.
endotoxin, which has direct
Yep.
binding effect when it comes through the proverbial leaky gut, which
Yep.
has an adverse effect on a myriad of different type of organs and structures, brain,
Absolutely.
testes, ovaries, etc.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, the expression of LPS in the blood increases the incidence of cardiovascular disease, gut to heart, by 3 times. So
Hmm.
I'm real interested in all the stuff that you're doing, but
Yep.
mostly interested in LPS because that's something I test for regularly as a standard bearer in my office on a daily
Hmm.
basis.
It's great you're doing that. Yeah, I mean LPS is huge. We published a study in the Journal of Cachexia and Sarcopenia, my former PhD student, mostly from the perspective of cancer cachexia, but we had a metastatic model of cancer where muscle wasting was very significant, and that was mitigated with ketones because ketones have an anti-catabolic effect metabolically, but also by decreasing inflammation. So we had asked the question, well, what if we just spike inflammation with LPS and we look at muscle wasting associated with that, which was robust, and then we could mitigate the LPS induced muscle
Mm.
wasting with ketones. So we've published that. That was a former student of mine, Dr. Andrew Kutnick. That was part of his dissertation, PhD dissertation research. So we think, inflammation is a very real problem in the general population, and ketone metabolic therapy is one way to get that under control and mitigate it.
Love it. I love it. Um, what is Metabolic Health Summit and the Metabolic Health Initiative? I know these are
Yeah.
two things you're involved with.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, Metabolic Health Summit started as like a metabolic therapeutics conference at University of South Florida. And I think, our first conference, we didn't advertise. Maybe we had like 200 people, and then we had it, every year, and it kept growing and growing. We moved it to California. More recently, the last year it was in Clearwater, Florida. And it is a scientific conference. It's a conference that combines basic science research with clinicians that also showcase their research. And then we have companies that are, really contributing to this space. So we want to network and align with different companies that are providing products that help us implement and sustain ketosis. And the content that we create through Metabolic Health Summit and the Metabolic Health Initiative, which is the entity that runs Metabolic Health Summit, is ACCME accredited. So the content that we have and that we collected can be medical education credits for people who attend the conference. And then we have an online platform where we have a variety of practitioners who teach about metabolic psychiatry, about neurology, about cancer therapies using different metabolic based approaches. So Metabolic Health Summit is the conference that we host, and that's to be determined when the next one will happen. And then the Metabolic Health Initiative is the entity that has the Metabolic Health Summit. We also have the Metabolic Link podcast, where we have various people come on and discuss their basic science research, clinical research, and we even have patients and dietitians come on and provide that educational content.
Well, love to support you in any way I can. So it's that
Thank you.
time we're going to do some wrap ups.
Okay.
So I will definitely tee this up for you. So to get ketone bodies or to you use a KMT, we found out we need to increase circulating numbers of ketones. We'll
Mhm.
find an improvement in weight loss and body composition and increase in satiety. will have cognitive performance be enhanced. The ketogenic diet, if I can use the term, increases longevity. You know, the incisive conversation of 2024 and beyond induces mental clarity, improves cognition, mood. We didn't get the opportunity to talk about it, but it was positive for both types of athletes, both performance and endurance athletes. So, as I always do, my buddy from Oxford, Dr. Robbins, says, Rob, at the end of the podcast, I need 3 to 5 things to change my day tomorrow and make me healthier. Dr. Dom, help out my friend.
Well, yeah, nutrition is obviously key, right? Because that's what we study, and I can unambiguously say that that's a huge lever to pull. So nail down your nutrition, and I'm also a big advocate of sunlight. So one of the first things I do when I wake up is that we live on a farm. I walk out in the lawn, the dewy grass with the sun coming up. I try to get that early sunshine, and I think that helps really synchronize and set our circadian rhythm. Get outside as much as possible, get natural sunlight, fresh air, and if you can, exercise. So that's like really key things, and also do it with someone that you love, with your partner, and just relationships I think are key for mental health and just human experience in general. So we have, well, one of the biggest hacks that people ask me is to have a pet. So we have dogs and we have animals, and our dogs have a non-negotiable walking in the morning and night. So that gets us out and to exercise. So nutrition, exercise, obviously, fresh air, sunlight, and do it with people or animals that you love, I think are the key.
Well, he's going to say, Rob, I want to get into ketosis. Give him 2 to 3 quick hacks on how to do it and how to test for it. You know, we didn't talk about that.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of blood measurements. The Keto Mojo device is really good. We use that. The Abbott Precision Extra is also another device we've published on in our research. So blood ketones above 0.5 millimolar would basically indicate that you are in ketosis and your brain is getting an alternative form of energy. So you start to get benefits above 0.5 millimolar, maybe even lower, if you look at some of the research. But generally, someone eating a standard American diet will never achieve that, essentially. So urine ketones are, if you don't like pricking your finger, are a way to semi-quantitatively at least indicate that you're, in a state of ketosis. And then there are different breath devices coming out. The BioSense device I've tested is pretty good. That's breath ketones. And then there's a new device I just got and I'll be testing today. Actually, it's called Keto Air. It also measures breath acetone. So I think they're all good. And I think you have to figure, if you don't like pricking your finger, then you may gravitate towards, urine ketones or breath ketones.
Nobody does it better in a ketogenic metabolic therapy than Dr. Dom D'Agostino. Thank you so much for taking your time. Sorry for keeping you over time. Got a ton more questions. We need to do part 2. My goodness, I think you just converted everybody to a ketogenic diet, and you were still positive in all the other things. My pleasure.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity.